Spain has moved to restore a full diplomatic footprint in Iran, formally reopening its embassy in Tehran after a weeks-long suspension that followed the outbreak of war and a wave of regional escalation. Spain's ambassador to Iran, Antonio Sanchez Benedito Gaspar, confirmed that embassy operations have resumed, describing the step as a return to direct engagement at a time when capitals across the region are cautiously testing the strength of a fragile ceasefire. He said the delegation re-entered Iran overland, signaling that Madrid intends to be present on the ground again, rather than managing the relationship remotely. In his public statement announcing the reopening, the ambassador framed the decision as part of a wider effort to push for de-escalation and stability. Asterisk, he said, together with my committed team, I have reopened today the Spanish embassy in Tehran in order to join in efforts for peace from every possible quarter. Attitude, the emphasis, Spanish officials say, is on support. Diplomatic channels that can help keep the ceasefire intact and prevent the conflict from reigniting. Beyond immediate crisis management, Spain is also positioning the reopening as a practical step toward restoring normal consular services and rebuilding longer-term cooperation. Officials have pointed to the need to reestablish a working presence to assist Spanish citizens, maintain dialogue with Iranian institutions, and explore areas where bilateral ties can be stabilized after the disruption of recent weeks. Madrid's message is twofold: that it views diplomacy as essential even in tense environments, and that keeping a seat at the table inside Iran matters for future negotiations, whether those discussions revolve around regional security, humanitarian concerns, or the broader question of how to prevent the conflict from widening again. At the same time, the embassy's return is feeding into a broader and increasingly bitter political argument inside the transatlantic alliance, one that has sharpened in the aftermath of the U.S. war with Iran and is now spilling into debates about NATO unity, basing access, and the cost of American security guarantees. U.S. President Donald Trump has been publicly venting anger at European allies, accusing them of withholding support at a moment he says Washington needed it most. In recent remarks, he argued that some NATO countries declined key forms of assistance, ranging from permissions tied to airspace and basing arrangements to naval participation during the military campaign and during efforts to address disruptions to energy shipping routes. In a wide-ranging complaint that extended beyond Europe, Trump argued that several major U.S. partners failed to step up. Asterisk, he said, it's not just NATO. You know who else didn't help us? South Korea didn't help us. You know who else didn't help us? Australia didn't help us. You know who else didn't help us? Japan asked it. He tied that frustration directly to the presence of USF. Forces stationed abroad, portraying those deployments as evidence that Washington carries burdens that allies too often take for granted. Trump then invoked troop levels in East Asia, again using them to argue that American commitments have not been matched with reciprocal support. He said, we've got 50,000 soldiers in Japan to protect them from North Korea. And he added, he said, we have 45,000 soldiers in South Korea to protect us from Kim Jong-un. The remarks reflected his broader point that U.S. forces are deployed forward, exposed to danger, and according to his argument, those risks should translate into more loyalty when Washington asks for help. In the same breath, Trump veered into a personal assessment of North Korea's leader and the current temperature of that relationship. He said, who I get along with very well, as you know. Then describing conditions on the Korean Peninsula, he said, asterisk, he said, do you notice how nice things are with North Korea? That's very nice. The tone was characteristic, part grievance, part performance, and part effort to portray his approach as uniquely effective compared with predecessors he blamed for letting threats grow. Trump's attack on NATO came with a blunt core claim that the alliance failed him during the Iran war. Asterisk, he said NATO wasn't there when U.S. needed them. And he used that allegation to amplify a separate, long-standing agenda item that has repeatedly shocked allies, the idea of the United States acquiring Greenland. The logic being advanced by some analysts is that the Iran conflict, rather than remaining a Middle East-centered crisis, has accelerated a deeper argument about strategic geography and global power competition. In this view, Allied reluctance during the war has reinforced Trump's instinct to reduce dependence on European partners and expand America's unilateral control of positions it considers critical, particularly in the Arctic. Greenland, while sparsely populated and covered by vast ice sheets, sits at the center of Arctic flight paths and North Atlantic security calculations. It also has growing economic significance, with attention focused on rare earth minerals and other resources that could be crucial for advanced manufacturing, defense technology, and the energy transition. Strategists who prioritize great power rivalry argue that the Arctic is shifting from a peripheral theater into a frontline zone, especially as climate change changes access routes and as China increases economic economic and scientific activity across the broader Arctic region. In that framing, the Iran war becomes relevant not because it is geographically connected to Greenland, but because it exposed political constraints. The United States may have overwhelming power, but it still needs partners to provide access, legitimacy, and logistical support. If partners hesitate, the argument goes, Washington may feel pressured to secure strategic assets it can control more directly. Still, critics challenge that interpretation and say it confuses noise for strategy. They argue that using a war to revive a controversial acquisition idea is less grand chessboard thinking than it is impulsive politics, designed to energize a domestic audience and punish allies rhetorically rather than to accomplish a realistic policy goal. The political calendar adds another layer of restraint. With U.S. elections approaching, many analysts believe the White House is unlikely to take steps that could trigger a major international crisis over Greenland, particularly if there are signs of fatigue among voters who have grown wary of new foreign entanglements. Even if the administration wanted to escalate, it would face diplomatic blowback from Denmark, resistance from European partners, and legal and political hurdles at home. That question of limits, what a president can actually do versus what a president can threaten, has become central again as Trump's anger at NATO shifts from peaches to reported planning, according to multiple reports circulating in Washington and European capitals. Trump has considered pulling U.S. troops out of NATO countries he views as insufficiently supportive during the Iran campaign and relocating those forces to nations he believes were more aligned with Washington's actions. The idea is being described as a rebalancing of U.S. military commitments in Europe, rewarding cooperation and penalizing refusal. Such a move, even if only partial, would be significant. American troop deployments in Europe are not just symbolic. They form part of the deterrence architecture against Russia and provide logistics, command capability, and rapid reinforcement options across the alliance. Shifting those forces would affect defense planning budgets and political confidence, especially in countries that rely heavily on U.S. presence for reassurance. But the more explosive prospect being discussed is Trump's renewed interest in withdrawing the United States from NATO altogether, an idea he has floated before and one that has always sent shockwaves through allied governments. Here, however, the legal reality matters. In the United States today, a president cannot simply walk away from NATO by personal decision. A law passed in 2023 effectively blocks unilateral withdrawal by requiring congressional approval, either two-thirds vote in the Senate or an act of Congress. That legislation has become one of the most consequential guardrails in modern U.S. foreign policy, and it was explicitly designed to prevent a single administration from dismantling the alliance without broad political consensus. It is also a reminder that even amid intense partisan conflict, NATO remains one of the rare subjects where strong bipartisan majorities have traditionally supported continuity. The irony, noted widely in Washington, is that the legislation was co-sponsored by Marco Rubio, who is now serving as Trump's Secretary of State. Rubio's Lear argument that no president should have sole authority to withdraw from NATO now stands as a direct procedural barrier if the White House attempts to make good on threats of an exit. Behind the scenes, resistance to leaving NATO is strong across both parties on Capitol Hill. Many lawmakers still describe the alliance as the central pillar of U.S. security and an amplifier of American power, one that allows Washington to shape global events with partners rather than alone. They argue that a U.S. withdrawal would not only weaken Europe's defensive posture, but also encourage adversaries who would interpret the move as a strategic retreat. Meanwhile, the policy dispute is unfolding against a tense and uncertain regional backdrop. Even with a ceasefire in place, the Middle East remains volatile. The Strait of Hormuz, one of the world's most critical energy choke points, has been at the center of fear about shipping disruptions and global economic shock. Trump has pushed allies to support efforts to secure navigation and restore stability. But in parts of Europe, there has been limited appetite for direct involvement after the war and caution about being pulled into a new phase of confrontation. Diplomatically, the moment has been awkward for NATO leadership as well. The alliance's Secretary General has been forced to manage public messaging that holds NATO together while navigating an American president who is willing to criticize members openly and threaten structural changes. Conversations between NATO's top leadership and the White House have been described as direct and candid, but without clear resolution, largely because the underlying dispute is political, not technical. And that brings the story back to Spain's reopening of its embassy in Tehran, an act that on its face is about diplomacy and normalization, but which also lands in the middle of a wider fight about alliance loyalty. From Madrid's perspective, the decision is being presented as a pragmatic R. E-turn, a measured step that follows the ceasefire and allows Spain to do what states traditionally do after conflict spikes: restore channels, protect interests, and keep options open. It also signals that Spain intends to engage with Iran through the tools of statecraft rather than through isolation alone, while maintaining its broader commitments within Europe and the alliance. From Washington's perspective, especially through the lens of Trump's public rhetoric, such moves can be interpreted differently as evidence that allies are choosing their own diplomatic timelines and priorities, even when the United States believes the conflict should still be treated as an active strategic emergency. That difference in interpretation is the heart of the transatlantic drift now being exposed. The United States increasingly describes the global environment as a series of urgent, interconnected threats requiring hard alignment. Many European governments, while acknowledging those threats, often approach them with different risk calculations, more emphasis on de-escalation, more skepticism about open-ended military commitments, and more concern about the domestic politics of public support. The Iran war has intensified those differences. It has also revived old grievances about burden sharing, the purpose of alliances, and whether U.S. power should be conditional. For Trump, the message has been simple and confrontational. Allies who do not help when asked should not expect the same level of American protection without consequences. His comments about partners in Asia, his attacks on NATO, and his talk of troop relocations all fit the same theme: transactional pressure tied to security guarantees. Yet the system still has constraints. Congress remains a barrier to a NATO exit. The Pentagon still weighs military practicality. Public opinion remains wary of deepening foreign involvement. And allies, even when frustrated, still recognize the costs of a full rupture in the near term. What is likely is not a dramatic break, but an extended period of tension, threats, counter-messaging, and incremental adjustments, perhaps including troop posture reviews, while diplomats work to preserve basic cooperation. Spain's embassy reopening is one visible indicator of that diplomatic push, an attempt to rebuild contact and influence at a time when war has strained every channel. But it is also a reminder that the post-war landscape is not simply about stopping the shooting. It is about reassembling the political relationships that wars tend to fracture. And right now, those fractures are not only in the Middle East, they are spreading across the Atlantic, testing NATO's unity, testing the limits of presidential power, and testing how far the world's most enduring alliances can bend before they begin to break.